particularly Dr. Singh. Dr. Singh and I communicated on LinkedIn about maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and I'm really impressed with the extent and extensiveness of this particular program that has been brought together. And I was listening to the speaker from CERN, and that is just fascinating work, and the kind of collaboration that we can foster in an online world. I'm privileged to present this afternoon. So if I say this morning, it's simply because of my time zone here in South Africa. It is a little bit cold here because we are in winter, and so, but it's not too bad. It's okay. So the talk is on inclusive online education, and some of this talk has propagated due to the strategy of the University of Johannesburg, which has been in the area of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and I'll come to that just now. But in the preamble, I thought that it is worth pausing for a moment, and in this pause to perhaps also look at one of the quotations that has been once mentioned by a renowned author, Arundhati Roy. And I will just read this paragraph to you. It is from Financial Times. And in this paragraph, author Roy says that whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. And I thought that this is a good kind of imagery that is brought about, and also in the context of the kind of portal that this pandemic has brought upon. Right now, you may notice that I'm actually working from home, and in South Africa, and like in a number of countries around the world, including in India, the countries have been placed on lockdown. When we went into lockdown here in South Africa, we had started the mode of blended learning for the last maybe 5-6 years. And so we had some experience and expertise in blended learning, but we had no idea of the scale and magnitude that would be required in being able to deliver blended learning to an institution the size we are. We are about 50,000 students in the university with about over 5,000 staff members. And these 50,000 students, when the lockdown process was started due to the coronavirus spread, students had to be dispersed all over some of them decided to return to their areas in the country, and some are based in rural settings. And other students, many of our students come from the continent of Africa, and they decided to go home. And so the digital connectivity and connectedness and the cost of data across the continent became another aspect that became important to us, because we recognized that coronavirus is not something, although we talk about the post-COVID period, it's not really a period that will emerge just like that tomorrow. It's actually a period that is likely to stay with us for some time. And how do we coexist with the coronavirus world is a question that we asked. Now, in the context of the University of Johannesburg, I'm going to just pause. I have several moments of pause, and that's because in today's world and the pace that we progress so fast that we don't always have a chance to stand back and reflect and take stock of what it is that we've done in terms of humanity and made progress, and then in terms of technology and the progress that technology has enabled. So in one of these pauses, Thomas Friedman, who wrote the book, Thank You for Being Late, Tom Friedman actually, and by the way, his own book came about because Tom was waiting for somebody in New York, and as you know, in New York, you often tend to be late because of traffic and those kind of things. And while he was waiting for somebody, the moment came about, and one of the learning moments was, human adaptability continues, but what about the pace at which technology rises? Now, if you look at this graph, and if you look at perhaps the period 2007, which is around here, in 2007, we had a number of advances. One of them was the iPhone came about, Facebook came about. And if you think about, how that changed the world, if you reflect retrospectively, we often say that 2020, the year 2020 is 2020, but it also reflects hindsight. And if you look at the power of hindsight relative to 2007, you can really appreciate what it's meant in terms of technology and how fast it has advanced. So it is not that it is not that we as people were not adapting. We were adapting. But what has happened is that technology has moved at a much faster rate. This caused us in about 2 years ago at the University of Johannesburg to relook at our strategy and whether our strategy should not, at a central and institutional level, also look at a catalytic initiative for what we call Global Excellence in Stature 4.0. Essentially, it is the integration of augmented intelligence, artificial intelligence, and African insights into all of our curricula, whether it is in the humanities or social sciences, whether it is in law, in business and economics, or in engineering, science, and technology. So it is an institution-wide program that brings about, that integrates technology in a transdisciplinary sense. So that's really where this kind of thinking came about in terms of the infusion of technology. I would say the appropriate infusion of technology, as at times when we integrate technology, a number of data and data ethics issues also emerge simultaneously. So it is important to not just look at technology for the sake of technology, but to look at technology in a transdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary sense. And that, I think, is an important, if you're looking at takeaways, that's a very key takeaway. Now, moving from there a little bit into what has happened in terms of the world. And so we saw that in early 2000, the Millennium Development Goals came about. And the Millennium Development Goals, where, if you read the Millennium Development Goals, they often talked about, how do you bring access to clean water and sanitation to 50%, at least half the world's population. So if you look at the pretext of the Millennium Development Goals, you'll often see, the 50% mark. Now, when the Sustainable Development Goals came about and was adopted, including by South Africa and by India in 2013, the Sustainable Development Goals, which has the timeline of 2030, had a different approach. The Sustainable Development Goals actually said that there are 17 goals, and these goals are not looking at 50% of the world, they're looking at 100% of the world. So the timeline is 2030. How do you bring clean water to the whole of the world? And when you start thinking about that, it is so ambitious that it is almost frightening. And at that time, when we were doing our own strategy work 2 years ago, we said that the Sustainable Development Goals are really important because they serve and they bring about, they look at gender equality, they look at high quality education, they look at sustainable partnerships, which is part of the things that we do when we have collaboration webinars like today. But the question is, how do you actually bring it all and integrate it all together? And we said for us, when we were doing our strategy, that the way for us is actually to integrate artificial intelligence and augmented intelligence or technology in a multidimensional way. So what does multidimensional way mean? And so one paper that was published by Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, who had been advisor to the United Nations Secretary General as the Sustainable Development Goals was coming up, was these four lenses. And these four lenses bring about a congruent, when they're put together and used in a congruent manner, you start to get a holistic approach to dealing with problems. So these lenses are geopolitics, earth systems, techno-economics, and social dynamics. And so let's use these four lenses when we take into account COVID-19 in the area of higher education. And from there, I will thematically build into the talk on inclusive education. So when COVID-19 came about, around the world, we started to see that the geopolitics changed. You would notice that initially, the World Health Organization was, going through the classification stages that led to the declassification of COVID-19 as a pandemic. But during that time, you would notice that the United States had a particular position towards China. And then during the last 3-4 months, you would have noticed that that position actually changed. So the geopolitical dimensions is something that changed. In South Africa, we also had impacts. For example, a lot of students that went, back into their home countries. It became a lot more complicated because the way that we look at migration changed. We also had students who were outbound into different parts of the world, including in China, in Russia, and we had to start looking into how do you actually what are the diplomatic protocols that can be used in terms of bringing some of these, or repatriating some of these students back. So the geopolitics became suddenly of great interest. At the same time, we saw that the techno-economics had a major impact because in South Africa, unlike in India, the cost of data is still high. And so we had those students who had access to data, and they had the means in terms of affordability to access that data. And then we had others who didn't. And so does that mean that COVID-19 has the possibility of further deepening the inequality between those that have and those that don't have? And what should be the appropriate bridge that should be an enabler? One aspect that came out of the COVID-19 transition was that certain websites should be zero rated, which means that if students are accessing those websites at the university, then those websites, they will not be charged to access those websites from within the country. And so zero rating then contributed to one element of building equity and equality. The third component is that of social dynamics. So right now we are in a lockdown, and in a lockdown there are people who are professionals like myself who are able to do a lot of our work online and using remote means. On the other hand, we have people who don't have, and when they don't have, there is a real possibility that there may be a social unrest. And a social unrest, will have an impact on the university. On the last lens is of Earth systems, and quite ironically, we find that the carbon footprint has decreased during this point because there are much less vehicles on the road. So these four lenses, when they're used in a congruent manner to look at a situation, you start to see angles that you would not normally see. And so this aspect of these four lenses would be a second takeaway that I'd propose from this talk. Now, in our own journey, as I mentioned, that COVID-19 started to appear. The first case appeared in March in South Africa, and before that we were going into, and we had ongoing educational transformation, and that really is speaking to blended learning. But then COVID-19 hit us, and we very quickly had to move into the area of an all online mode. And that becomes particularly complicated because, you have domains such as the science and engineering, which are lab-based and have practical components. And how do you then enable access to the lab environment remotely? How do you develop assessments? And those are some of the things that I'll highlight during this presentation. We also had to look at personal protection equipment, and we had to look at rapid prototyping for some of these protection equipment, especially as we did start to reintegrate some of our students. Of the 50,000 students, about 9,000 students started to return in the month of June. And we therefore had to make provisions in terms of protection equipment, and I'll speak to that. And I think that in itself has an education component. And I don't know, I put down here post-COVID-19 period. I have no idea what the timeline is. These milestones are certainly not linear. We have no idea what it is, but it has brought about two things which are important in the context of any university. One is the financial crisis, one is the health crisis, and two is the financial crisis, in that order. The financial crisis is particularly something that, we as a university, for example, have stopped our new recruitment of staff members, partly because we are uncertain of how our financial is going to be. We're obviously going to open up gradually as things start to improve. But we are, that's one of the reactions that you're likely to get when there is a period of uncertainty. But on the other hand, we are saying, how do we evolve our business as a university such that we can actually have online programs that develops access? We have had cases where some of our students who are differently abled have actually said that, in their realm, online education, gives them captions and gives them a mode and a feel for inclusivity that they may have not had as sufficiently when we were dealing with the on-site classroom environment. So you can really start to see that if you're using those four lenses in a congruent manner, you can start to find solutions in a much more transdisciplinary manner than before. And so for us, the avenue of the fourth industrial revolution, because we were already moving in that direction, COVID-19, in a way, as negative as it is, has actually been a catalyst in terms of our own journey. And we are really looking at, the innovations that are coming out during this period, is how do we make those innovations sustainable? So one point that might be of interest, that when we were looking at the industrial revolutions, when you were thinking of the first and second industrial revolutions, you were thinking of a classroom setting. You were thinking of benches that are put in a column behind each other. Think about a classroom. In a classroom, you have seats one behind each other. And the reason for that is that the industrial revolutions, particularly the first and the second, and maybe the third industrial revolution as well, required some kind of routine thinking, So if you imagine the benches in a classroom, it is almost similar to an industrial setup where you would be passing material from one to the next. And that is kind of the routine learning that the first and second industrial revolutions brought about. Now, from the third industrial revolution, where the computing and communication started to converge, and the fourth industrial revolution, which infuses artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning into the way that we harness the power of data, takes us into a completely new dimension. That means that we have to unlearn, learn, and relearn, and continuously do this over and over again. And that becomes also important in the way that we render and deliver curriculum and pedagogy. Now, I just wanted to give you a feel, because I don't, I don't know how well this audience may know South Africa. So South Africa has got two distinct economies that run in parallel. The one economy is almost really a first world economy, and you can see this in the right side of the picture. On the other hand, if you go 15 minutes away, you can find really poor areas, and it is a country which has a Gini coefficient of about 60, an unadjusted Gini coefficient of about 63%, making it one of the most unequal countries in the world, where you have poverty and rich almost side by side. And so this aspect of inequality is something that we always take into account in whatever solution that we do, because we believe that education is the way that you can move people from areas of poverty to areas that brings about a meaning and develops dignity for humanity. So to give you some examples of some of the innovations that have occurred during this period, we have obviously looked at developing some of our own personal protection equipment. 3D printing of masks, for example, has come about. But on the other hand, we also have to look at whether these masks are scalable and whether they are cost effective. So we have also looked at some entrepreneurial work where the students and some of our suppliers can develop cloth masks as an alternative and also for cost effectiveness. But you can see the different stages and the different approaches that have come about during this process. We've also looked at our own sanitizers, which are based on the World Health Organization. We've also developed our own ventilator. And if you do a Google on University of Johannesburg ventilator, you will notice that this was one of the large-scale projects that came about, and we're looking at how do we bring about scalability. But again, when we're doing a ventilator project, for us it also integrates Internet of Things. It includes internet sensors, and it includes an approach for rapid prototyping, so that when the COVID-19 period is over, what has remained behind is the skills and an approach that enables rapid prototyping. But on the other hand, also, a ventilator like this will accrue a lot of data. And how do you use that data? One, from a health informatics perspective, but two, in terms of developing the technology. But when you're doing any of the above, you have to keep in mind that when you're looking at patient data, that the data ethics is really key. As if individual data leak, for example, could be very problematic for us. And so, how do you look at and use that data in an aggregate way? So, I guess what I'm saying with these two examples of the PPEs and the ventilator is that the timing has kind of forced us to expedite and accelerate our program in terms of hands-on learning side by side with what happens in terms of theoretical acquisition, but theoretical acquisition can be done online. Another component that became very prominent in terms of inclusive online education, the inclusive component, is the aspect of open source. And again, as a university, for a number of years, we've been looking, we have been making available all the research that gets published is available on an open access platform. Again, if you do a Google on University of Johannesburg institutional repository, you will very quickly get access to publications. We make that available because we're a publicly funded institution. We believe in making our research available to the public globally at no cost. What is, however, interesting is that the open source, making available your code, had often looked at intellectual property protection, and instruments such as patents, such as copyright, was very key. Now, when it comes to health and our response to COVID-19, we've taken a different approach where we have actually not looked at copyright. We have looked at open source. We've looked at copyleft, the opposite of copyright. It's really a pun that is intended on copyright, copyleft, and the significance there is let's make available what is needed in terms of the global response for COVID-19, and let's make that available on an open source platforms so that we can together progress what is required in terms of designs and instrumentation that would help in the medical response. So this also, there's the ecological impact that I mentioned, but of interest here is that you also have to think about solutions which are energy efficient. So it's not simply about, solutions that are a technology response, but if you think about the continent, there are many areas where there's not enough electricity. So you also have to think in terms of renewable technology that is powering some of these solutions. So what is coming out here is a real holistic approach to the thinking. And I bring back those four lenses again with the emphasis that the fourth industrial revolution and our response to COVID-19 require holistic thinking. So what are some of the components from an inclusive online education aspect? Well, inclusivity is central to it. Innovation is very key. Integrity is another component, and infrastructure. So those are some pillars that are important, and then they inform what happens in a university setting in terms of curriculum, the way that we deliver curriculum or pedagogy, in terms of research, and ensuring quality or accreditation, and then assessment that is done in a meaningful way. Now, I'll give you some examples of each of these in the next couple of slides. On the other hand, one also has to keep the cybersecurity in mind. I did talk about data and ethics from a student data point of view. We are very, very careful in terms of ensuring that student and personal data is protected. But on the other hand, what has also been happening is that the dark web has come about. And I remember when Dr. Singh and I were initially engaging, I had asked her about the online platform that we're using, because some of the online platforms have experienced cyber bombing. Sometimes the recording happens and it gets available without always permission from the audience and so on. And sometimes the programming is interrupted. And so the dark web has also come about, and ransomware as a service, for instance, has become a lot more prominent. So I guess what I'm saying is that as we're looking at inclusive online education, it's also important to be aware that the cyber crime and cyber infrastructure has to be thought about hand in glove, so that the one does not, the progress is not diminished by the challenges of cybersecurity. So in terms of curriculum, there are several tenets here, and most of you know that this is important when it comes to the way that learning occurs. Now, for us and for you, I suppose that when we think about
sorry, Professor, participants, mute your speakers. Just creating a distraction.
Okay, thank you. When it comes to the curriculum, we have often thought about, teaching. What does the university do? Do we teach or do we do research? And for us, teaching has always been defined as what is research and innovation-led. Those are really integral to when it comes to developing teaching. Now, research and innovation usually has a component that is not simply in the textbook, but is a component that happens when like when I'm talking, you're noticing that I'm moving my hands, because learning happens for different people differently. And that's important to understand, that learning does happen for different people differently. Technology, fortunately, allows us to be able to access to the different modes of learning. And so some people are for some people, learning occurs when you write. Some people, learning occurs not in the classroom, but as you walk away from the classroom, you look at your friend, you speak to your friend, and you say, do you think that's what this individual or the lecturer meant? And when you get that reaffirmation, that's when learning has occurred. That means that when you look at this, that the aspect of emotion and cognition is often intertwined. And that is something that at times becomes difficult in the online world, because maybe we are very focused in the online world. We're not always pausing and being able to reflect. And so what we are also trying to do in the inclusive online education is to give our students break. So you present A, B, and C, and you say, now we're going to pause. Now you go and do certain things in your environment. But then the student would say, hey, but I don't have these A, B, and C available in my environment. And so you have to be creative in terms of cost-effective materials that illustrate the principle that is being discussed and debated through that particular learning thread that is being built. So that's an important component. Now I recap here on something that Benjamin Franklin had said probably in around 1730, but I think it's still valid today, which is tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And that, I think, is very key as a takeaway. That's another takeaway. That segues me into the pedagogical aspect. I've touched on some of these things. Now, in online education, there are certain advantages that can come about. So we at the university use a platform called Blackboard Predict. And what Blackboard Predict gives us is it tells us how engaged are our students to a particular lecture. So the lecture might be there might be an online lecture, it might be a video. Now we can actually go into the details of that video. We can look at whether students were struggling, whether there was a lack of contact. Was the student only looking at that 20-minute video for 2 minutes? Or if that is the case, should that video in the first place have been for 2 minutes times 10? In other words, 10 short bursts of what was being captured? Or should it have been a 20-minute video? Now, based on the data analytics, we can actually work back what is the most suitable mode for that particular student. And the student is then able to customize the person's learning experience. So I think that is very important here, is that if I interface with my mobile phone, I don't interface with my mobile phone for 20 minutes. I interface for maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. And if that learning is occurring through a mobile delivery, perhaps the way that our presentations occur need to account for that. Because the way that people interact with particular devices has changed, and the way that we learn has changed. And acknowledge what has happened in terms of pedagogical development over the last 20 years, and these are published in peer-reviewed journals, and look at what has happened in the world of learning and integrate that into the way that we deliver on education. Virtual reality and augmented reality is very interesting here, because we, for example, in the past we would get students from India who would be inbound as doing courses online, they would be visiting physically, which is something that we intend to continue. But during the COVID-19 period, that is not possible. So what we have done is we have introduced virtual mobility programs. And in the virtual mobility program, students can have an augmented experience of our environment, of our different campuses. We have 4 campuses in Johannesburg. And so that they get a much better understanding of what it means in terms of immersing yourself in a different environment while you're not there. So that once after the lockdown, once our borders and transportation reopens, and when students are able to travel, they already have better preparation in terms of what the context means. And so those are some ideas in terms of pedagogy. Now, assessment has become challenging in the sense that, you can't do a simple examination because moderators may not be available in different parts of the country. Students are all over. And so what we are looking at is project-based learning, where you have to do certain things that evaluates the outcomes and then write a report or have an online, have a presentation on video or an audio recording or a report which is written and then submitted online for assessment. But the good, interesting thing about the project-based learning is that if a student is doing a major in mathematics and is doing a minor in music, you can now evaluate the student through a project-based methodology on the music of mathematics. And so you're now able to look at this from a transdisciplinary point of view, and not only from mathematics for the sake of mathematics, but mathematics where the logic connects to music. And that, I think, is something that we were not able to really, in the university environment, we were doing these things in silos. And now, due to COVID-19 and the aspect of inclusivity, and because traditional assessment has been challenged, we now have to think outside of the box, and here is an opportunity that lies for the post-COVID period. I think that when Arundhati Roy has indicated that the new normal is perhaps the normal that we have desired, I think some of it is highlighted in some of these opportunities that are coming about. Interestingly, the world of work, the future world of work, is going to change, and in fact is changing and has changed. And the inclusive online education is really taking us into that world of the future world of work. It's just making it, there's just a catalyst that is enabling that. So for us, in this, amidst this negativity, there is also a lot of learning that continues to occur. Now, in the area of research, the scholarship of teaching and learning, publishing in journals, like one journal that I have worked with is the IEEE Transactions on Education. And there are a number of journals that has a whole area of new learning analytics, which can be published, of course, without compromising student individual data or data ethics, but looking at aggregate data and how does aggregate data project and develop learning. And then also the areas of the different learning management systems. The field work has changed. The way that we do service, we do research, we have to re-engineer research service that occur in the social sciences, particularly because on-site service had a value and the research was designed based on on-site surveys. Now we have to look at online service and how do you make sure that when online surveys occur, that the research integrity of the research design is not compromised, but is strengthened. And how do you then inform and enable your participants so that that research has meaning in terms of developing the body of knowledge? On the other hand, what we're also finding, and this may be different in different places, and it might be due to the inequality situation in South Africa, is that student and staff wellness is also being challenged. We're finding that particularly for our women, that there is an increase in gender-based violence, and postgraduate students who may be doing their PhD are often also mothers. And this means that there is a gender imbalance that is emerging in this process, and that the way forward that we think about has to do certain things that will bring about a correction in terms of developing gender equity, which may be compromised during this period. But there are psychosocial impacts. And as you may be feeling if you're doing online education, right now you're listening to me, I'm present, but at the same time I'm absent. So this conundrum of being present and absent simultaneously over a prolonged time has a psychosocial implication, and that's another aspect that also lends to the world of research in what would it mean when we are coexisting with COVID-19. So I talked about assessment already, but I think the interesting point here is how do you build quality assurance so that you don't compromise the quality of the assessment? And then accreditation. And the problem with accreditation is a very traditional world. And so I have been interacting with some of the accreditation bodies in South Africa, which have an international influence and are signatory of international accords like Washington Accord, Sydney Accord, and Dublin Accord. And these are accords in the engineering domain to say, how do we actually acknowledge that the world is moving online? And how do we actually bring about different modes of learning? That is something we've always desired. We've always desired transdisciplinarity, but how do we then bring about quality assessment and consistency such that accreditation and quality assurance of our academic programs continues to be enabled and also allows for for mobility of students once they've completed a program from one country to the other. What is the question of how do we use machine learning? Do we have to look at accreditation and assessment and consistency in a traditional manual fashion, or can we leverage deep learning and machine learning because we have the data available on our learning management systems? How do we augment accreditation as another aspect? So in conclusion, one is that pandemics have come about, they've changed the world, And, the key aspect here is that technology has brought about certain advancements, and our adaptability is more than ever before. And how do we harness the power of our adaptability, our open-mindedness, in saying how do we sustain the innovations that are emerging out of this period? The third part is that the competition is going to increase. So, for example, at the university, we offer maybe a first-year course in calculus. And if you look at another university such as MIT, they also offer a first-year course in calculus. Do we continue to offer our calculus because we've always done so? Or do we say that there is already an online course that is available and let our students go into that online classroom because it's open access, and we then have our assessment, which is customized to our local environment? And if we're able to do that, how do we then, the capacity that is released during that period, how do we use that capacity and that resourcing to enable other programs in research and innovation? So how do we optimally utilize the resources that are available at a global scale? Because the world is clearly global. On the other hand, we're also very realistic. We're very realistic because we realize that the competition that COVID-19, if you look at, for example, the online programs that Harvard University is developing, they are really already in this mode of these 5-minute short videos that look at thematic considerations in a module such as calculus. And they are really looking at how does, what is the learning and how does that adapt? And if they then move into our environment virtually in South Africa, a university locally will not be able to compete as easily with what is being offered on the global stage. And so that component of being able to adapt and localize so that we can look at certain programs. For example, South Africa is very, very rich in mining, in biodiversity, in indigenous knowledge systems. And so to look at the niches that are local to that particular geographical area and then develop our online programs from there so that we have a unique value proposition when it comes to education and collaboration. Not doing what another part of the world is doing just for the sake of doing. That, I think, is quite interesting, is that competition and collaboration, the landscape, would actually evolve to be a lot more complementary. Last point here is that, that there is a real opportunity for us to shape the future world of work, and that despite that we have a lot of negativity, at core is the aspect of health. And when it's the aspect of health, we're actually looking at getting closer to humanity. We are a lot more caring about people than we've ever been before. We're thinking of mental well-being all the time of our students, of our staff. We're thinking all the time in terms of psychosocial implications. These are things we've never thought about in the past. We know that these are areas that exist, and these are problems that many times we don't like to talk about, but they're very important because humanity is enabled when we care. And how do we bring that aspect of care into the way that we deliver education? And that actually, inclusivity and in education, that brings me to the end of this talk. And I know we ran about 5-10 minutes late. I will be quite happy to take any questions right now, or if questions are enabled through the WhatsApp platform, then Dr. Singh can send those over to me, and I'd be very happy to blog out and answer or a response as well. So I'm going to hand back. I see that the moderator is here already, so I'll turn over to her.
Thank you, sir. Participants, the forum is now open for your questions. Kindly unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand.